Former top Trump White House officials and cabinet members have an urgent message they are trying to get out ahead of Election Day. 2 of his secretaries of state, 2 of his secretaries of defense, 2 of his national security advisors, his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, his attorney general, his secretary of education, his secretary of the Treasury, his White House press secretary, and his chief of staff. All were chosen by President Trump, all were politically aligned, all watched him in action, and all, in words and deeds, give their opinion on whether he should return to power. Vice President Mike Pence.
I want the American people to know that I had no right to overturn the election. And then on that day, President Trump asked me to put him over the Constitution. But I chose the Constitution, and I always will. I mean, I really do believe that anyone who puts themselves over the Constitution should never be President of the United States. And anyone who asks someone else to put themselves over the Constitution should never be President of the United States again.
Secretary of State Rex Tillerson.
How would you describe Donald Trump?
It was challenging for me, coming from the disciplined, highly process-oriented ExxonMobil Corporation, to go to work for a man who is pretty undisciplined, doesn't like to read, doesn't read briefing reports, doesn't like to get into the details of a lot of things, but rather just kind of says, look, this is what I believe, and you can try to convince me otherwise, but most of the time you're not going to do that.
How did your relationship go off the rails?
Well, we did not have a common value system. When the president would say, well, here's what I want to do, and here's how I want to do it. And I'd have to say to him, well, Mr. President, I understand what you want to do, but you can't do it that way. It violates the law. It violates a treaty. You know, he got really frustrated.
Secretary of Defense James Mattis, in an op-ed he wrote to the New York Times during the George Floyd protests. Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try. Instead, he tries to divide us. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years of this deliberate effort. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years without mature leadership. We can unite without him, drawing on the strengths inherent in our civil society. National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster's in the week after the January 6th riot.
As I wrote then, I said, there are many reasons for this assault on the Capitol, but foremost among them was the president's exhortations, was the president's sustained disinformation, what you covered earlier in the show, denying the results of the election, spreading these unfounded conspiracy theories and claims of widespread corruption. And so I think what we just saw is we saw the absence of leadership, really anti-leadership, and what that can do to our country. You know, we are in traumas, and you just talked about these with Ron, right? We have this quadruple trauma of a pandemic, a recession associated with the pandemic, the social divisions laid bare by George Floyd's murder and the aftermath, and now this vitriolic partisan political season that we're still mired in. Now, when you're into trauma, you need a leader to assure the American people, to allay fears, instead of inciting fears and making them feel even more disenfranchised.
In the days immediately following the January 6th riot, reportedly, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Secretary of the Treasury Steve Mnuchin, and Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos were so disturbed by his actions that they investigated the process for invoking the 25th Amendment to remove Trump from power rather than allow him to finish the remaining couple weeks of his term.
The amendment became important on January 6th and 7th. Could you tell us really what it was like, Betsy, to go into the depth of that?
Well, I was only personally familiar with the 25th Amendment, and so, I really wanted to understand, does this potentially apply in this case, and if so, how does it actually work? And so I did have a number of conversations that day about, how that would unfold, and when it was clear from Vice President Pence that he was not going to pursue that, or he would not, go that direction, then it became clear to me what I had to do.
Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, at his retirement address.
We are unique among the world's military. We don't take an oath to a king or a queen or a tyrant or a dictator. And we don't take an oath to a wannabe dictator. We don't take an oath to an individual.
Mark Milley is quoted in Bob Woodward's presidential biography, War. He is the most dangerous person ever. I had suspicion when I talked to you about his mental decline and so forth, but now I realize he's a total fascist. He is now the most dangerous person to this country, a fascist to the core. Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper.
You've made clear you see President Trump as a threat to democracy, not just a flawed candidate, a threat to democracy, you've said. Upon his retirement last week, General Mark Milley, an ally of yours during your time in office, appeared to refer to him in his farewell speech as a wannabe dictator. Is that overstating things, a dictatorship?
Well, look, if you go back the week prior, Donald Trump said that Milley, for his behavior, whatever he thought that should be punished, and he talked about execution, which was completely unfair. Mark Milley served this country honorably for 40 plus years in war and peace, moved, dragged his family around 20 plus times. He deserves our respect and admiration, and not that type of talk. No less coming from the commander-in-chief, the former commander-in-chief. So look, I have a lot of concerns about Donald Trump. I have said that he's a threat to democracy. I think the last year, certainly the last few months of Donald Trump's presidency will look like the first few months of the next one, if that were to occur.
National Security Advisor, John Bolton.
I'll meet with Putin, I'll meet with Zelensky. They both have weaknesses and they both have strengths. And within 24 hours, that war will be settled. It'll be over. It'll be absolutely over.
Do you want Ukraine to win this war?
I don't think in terms of winning and losing.
I just wonder what it was like for you to sit there and listen to those answers.
Well, here's the silver lining. Those answers show why Donald Trump is not fit to be president of the United States. No rational person believes that you can get the Ukrainians and the Russians to agree how to resolve it in 24 hours. And the very fact he says he doesn't think in terms of winning and losing shows he's utterly out of touch with what the war is all about and what the implications of Russia's aggression against Ukraine are all around the world.
You once said that he barely knew where Ukraine was. One thing he repeated that night as well was that he said if he was in office that Putin would not have invaded Ukraine.
Yeah. Trump has this impression that foreign leaders, especially adversaries, hold him in high regard, that he's got a good relationship with Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un. In fact, the exact opposite is true. I have been in those rooms with him when he's met with those leaders. I believe they think he's a laughing fool. And the idea that somehow his presence in office would have deterred Putin is flatly wrong. If anything, if Trump had won a second term and done what I think he intended to do, which is get out of NATO, Putin would have just waited and let him do it. And even the weakening of NATO would have made it a lot easier for the Russians to have prevailed.
White House Press Secretary Stephanie Grisham.
He's on his revenge tour for, people who dared to vote for impeachment. And I want to just warn people that once he takes office, if he were to win, he doesn't have to worry about re-election anymore. He will be about revenge. He will probably have some pretty draconian policies that go on. There were conversations a lot of times that people would say, that'll be the second term, that'll be the second term, meaning we won't have to worry about a re-election.
You write that you were concerned about a young press aide who was getting inappropriate attention and comments from President Trump. Should you have done more to protect her?
I don't know if I could have. There's not an HR department at the White House where you can go and say, hey, the President of the United States is acting inappropriately.
You can go to the Chief of Staff.
I didn't feel comfortable talking to Mark Meadows. I don't believe he would have done anything. So I did the best I could in terms of never letting her be alone with him in the cabin. I tried to keep her off trips as often as I could. I did the best I could, I think, in that environment.
Was it a mistake to work for President Trump?
Yes.
Why'd you do it?
Like I said, in the beginning, watching how people reacted to him. And I do believe he gave voice to a lot of people who did feel forgotten. But I think that many of us, myself included, got into that White House and got heady with power and became really, we didn't think about serving the country anymore. It was about surviving in there. And he loved it. He loved the chaos. And it's bad.
Attorney General Bill Barr.
And it's also quite typical in this sense, you know, these two individuals, Nauta and Carlos, are dragged into this thing. Their lives turned upside down by Trump to pursue, you know, this caper of his. And he leaves in his wake ruined lives like this, the people who went up to Capitol Hill, these individuals, many of the people who served him in government that got sucked into things. And he just leaves all this carnage in his wake.
Do you think he cares about that?
No, he doesn't care about that. Loyalty is a one-way street for him. And in many ways, you know, I think these two people down in Mar-a-Lago represent many Republicans who feel that they have to man the ramparts and defend this guy no matter what he does and go along with him. And I think they have to be careful or they're going to end up as part of the carnage in his wake.
Now, Trump has promised that if he gets back into office, he's very blatant about this, about using the Justice Department to go after his political opponents. Do you worry that he would weaponize it if he was back in office?
Absolutely, and that's why I think it's so ironic all these people are getting huffy about weaponization, which they should, because we can't go tit for tat. But Trump, as you say, I mean, he's very clear about it. I think there's no question that he believes these institutions should be used to go after his enemies.
White House Chief of Staff John Kelly in a statement to The Atlantic. What can I add that has not already been said? Trump is a person who thinks that those who defend their country in uniform, or are shot down or seriously wounded in combat, or spend years being tortured as POWs are all suckers because there's nothing in it for them. A person who did not want to be seen in the presence of military amputees because it doesn't look good for me. A person who demonstrated open contempt for a Gold Star family, for all Gold Star families, on TV during the 2016 campaign, and rants that our most precious heroes who gave their lives for America's defense are losers and wouldn't visit their graves in France. A person who is not truthful regarding his position on the protection of unborn life, on women, on minorities, on evangelical Christians, on Jews, on working men and women. A person that has no idea what America stands for and has no idea what America is all about. A person who cavalierly suggested that a selfless warrior who had served his country for 40 years in peacetime and war should lose his life for treason, in expectation that someone would take action. A person who admires autocrats and murderous dictators. A person that has nothing but contempt for our democratic institutions, our Constitution, and the rule of law. There's nothing more that can be said. God help us. As I put out this video, the election is almost here and the odds are 50-50. If these voices have convinced you that Trump should not be elected, you need to vote for Harris. The race will come down to these 7 swing states. So if you know anyone that lives in any of these states, please share this video with them. And finally, like and subscribe to this video so that the YouTube algorithm knows to show it to more people. Thank you.